Hi, I'm Ridhya Raj, and you've tuned into the author interview. Now, books have this phenomenal ability to take you on a journey to the depths of life that your mind has not even been able to fathom as yet. However, the person behind the book, that matters too. Now, you've known our guest from hard-hitting news journalism. She's informed the nation year after year, and here to share her author journey is the phenomenal Vanessa Govender. Vanessa, welcome to the author interview.
Thank you very much, Rajeshpuri, and it is a privilege to be sitting in conversation with you.
It is an absolute honor for me, and I want to start at the very beginning. As a writer, what did the first steps of this journey look like for you?
So if we go back to my very first book, which was a children's book written under my married name, it's called The Selfish Shongololo, and I had given up mainstream journalism. I had a baby, so I couldn't really do the two together because I covered a
Mm,
lot of hard news, a lot of crime, a lot of human suffering, a lot of human trauma, and it took its toll on me emotionally. So I quit mainstream journalism to focus on being a mother. And I've always wanted to write, but I mean, it was more of a dream, and you never quite really, because writing actually takes a bit of effort, like sitting down and actually writing. So the idea is better in your head than actually sitting down to work. But the children's book unfolded. I was feeding my son. I think he might have been about 10 months old at the time, and it was a struggle to feed him. So we were sitting near a window, and I happened to be looking out the window, and I saw birds and whatever I saw outside of my window, I started making up a story for him there and then as I was feeding him. And that story kind of stuck with me. And then I chatted to a few people about this story. He ate all his food, by the way. He was that engrossed in the story. Um, so I spoke to a few people about this, and they said, no, it sounds like a lovely story. So it took very many months before I sat down and actually typed it out and
mhm.
then submitted to a publisher. So the journey of writing, I wish I could say that it involved, a clear-cut, sort of rigid pattern or format where I sat down and I was like, I'm going to do this, start typing feverishly at my computer. Not at all. And I think it speaks a lot to my personality. I'm a bit of a procrastinator. I dither, I drag my feet. But when I do eventually get into something, then, as my husband says, I just shut the world out and it's me and what I'm doing. And I think his famous line is, the world could be falling apart and burning, and you are just so into what you're doing, nothing can distract you. So the writer's journey for me, it's and I think it's such a unique one to every author, really, because a lot of it is character and personality driven. And I'm flighty, and I'm all over the place, and I can drag things on. And that's kind of my writing process. But once I'm in it and I'm in the zone, um, I think nothing distracts. So I started with the children's book, then got on to my memoir.
Yeah.
I mean, we can talk about that. Um, and that all happened post journalism. So I think the long and short of it is, if I was still doing mainstream journalism, I don't think I could have poured heart and soul into writing, because you literally do bleed on the
Yeah.
pages, whether it is um, a memoir, or whether it is a children's book. It does. It's energy. It's every bit of your soul that is poured out onto paper. So I probably could not have done the both. I think there are people who do, and they're amazing and incredibly talented. I don't think I'm in that league or category. For me, it's one thing or the other.
I think, firstly, it's so beautiful that your baby was the catalyst for your writing journey to begin. There's something so pure about that. And even the fact that you're just trying to make him eat, because as an Indian woman, like if your baby's not eating, like that's holding you, you know? So I love that that was
Course.
your catalyst. And I think it's so true when you say that you bleed into your books because many authors have said something along the same lines of there's a version of them that lives and dies with that book. And once it's away from them, that's that version of them gone. And it's so true because this is art, this is passion, this is creation. And that's what makes it, I feel you can tell as a reader when you go through those pages that this is something that the writer put their heart and soul into. And those who are still holding on to other aspects of their careers while writing, they are burning out because of this, because they're pouring themselves into their books and at the same time still having to burn at the other end as well. And when it came to your memoir, what had been the catalyst for you in that regard?
My first memoir, Beaten but Not Broken, uh, dealt with a long-term BC. This was my first partner, my
Mm,
first intimate partner. Um, this was somebody who was relatively well known within the community and within the radio media circle. So obviously, when that relationship ended, when I started my career on TV, that relationship had ended. Um, all that trauma stayed buried with me. There were very few people who knew about what had happened. There were even fewer people who knew about the extent of what had happened. And those were just literally people in my very close circle, my
yeah.
parents, late dad. And then when I met my husband, was something that we had spoken about. So this was trauma that I had carried, a secret that I had carried, um, that I considered quite shameful.
Yeah.
I was ashamed. I was ashamed that this had happened to me. I was ashamed that I allowed it to happen to me for such a long time because obviously I evolved as a human being, I evolved as a woman um, since that relationship. And, the more I looked back, the more something was brewing inside of me, emotionally, mentally, physically, and the enormity of what had happened. Um, and you talk about post-traumatic stress, it's a very real thing.
Oh,
The
yeah.
thing of not being able to sleep, the state of being triggered. I was a mother, I was a new mother. I was in a very loving, safe relationship, but there was still fear, there was still shame. And I did not want to hold on to that anymore. And I wanted to release that. And I started writing, and I'd written about 2 chapters or 3 chapters, and I really didn't think anybody would want to read this for the simple fact that GBV, um, you know, these are stories that we are inundated with every single day. What makes mine so exceptional? I'm no different to any
Mm,
other GBV survivor. Why would anyone want to read this? There was the added platform of being a former, TV news reporter, of this happening at the SABC. And I wrote, and it obviously ignited or triggered an avalanche. Um, people talk about writing being cathartic. And I don't know that it was so much cathartic, or maybe that was how, it was meant to work, this process of healing where you are forced to confront who you were, forced to confront what happened, and finally be able to rage, mourn, and grieve who you were, what happened. And, justice sometimes is not always found in a court of law.
Yeah.
Justice is not always a legal thing. Justice is sometimes just being able to tell your story, you know, exposing yourself as the victim. But here's the even greater thing. In exposing yourself as the victim, you give you give a name and a face to the abuser.
Yeah.
You bring it out into the light, and that is where the cathartic or the healing had happened, because I had never cried the way I did. I had never felt as intensely as how I had felt when this book I had written, and in the days and months post it's going to shelf to the bookshelves and bookstores. Um, and that for me, it's like it's a very personal thing, and you never get to hear about the messy side of writing, about bringing a book um, to readers, about bringing a book to bookstores, about bringing a book to publishing. You never hear about that messy side, about, we talk about pouring ourselves and our souls onto the page, but what it comes with. And especially when it's something that deals with intimate partner violence.
Yeah.
Um, it's on a level. I think people who read the book and people who knew of the story and whatever, I don't think anybody could have fully appreciated what it brought, because at one point, I mean, I had even felt and I'd even given voice to the thought where I did not want to be here anymore. It was that intense, and the enormity of what had happened.
Mm.
I'd said, I don't think I want to be here anymore. Um, and so the healing was a messy, um, raw, unbridled, um, imperfect thing. And somebody said to me, well, actually, my husband said to me at the time when I said, I don't want to be here anymore, because I had those thoughts, I had those feelings, about this terrible thing that had happened, and this is what happened to me, and oh my goodness, how close I had come to not making it out alive and in one
Yeah.
piece, and 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 the anger, that another human being could do this, and I kept quiet about it, and I'd never done anything about it. And these words are so profound, and they're applicable to everybody. You know, I he said to me, "Don't judge the girl you were by the woman you are." And that's the phases we talk about, the evolution of self, of unbecoming, because that is what was happening. I was unbecoming,
Mm.
everything that I was programmed to be and everything I was taught to be. Um, and even who I am now, compared to who I was like 5, 6 years ago, and who I will be in 10 years from now, looking back, when I look back, and probably, if I live, to 10 years from now, look back on an interview like this, and I'll think, I'm a completely different person.
Yeah.
That is our evolution.
That is, wow. I feel like, I, from my perspective, the reason as to why you felt so much in the aftermath in terms of writing and publishing and distributing your book is because when these heinous acts are taking place, we're so focused on survival. We're just trying to get through it, that there is no room to feel, because if we feel, we will fall apart and we will not survive it. And so I think the healing wouldn't have been able to take place if you hadn't taken this journey to write it out and to purge it out. It's almost like when you have a bad wound, it's gonna burn like hell to flush that out, but otherwise it just stays in and festers. And that's exactly what you did. And I feel like many people may have the same notion that you did of what makes this story different? Why would anyone read this? What makes it stand apart? And the reality is, too few people take the step because intimate partner violence is so rife. Honestly, I feel like we'd be hard pressed to find five women who have not experienced it. Having domestic violence take place, it's so common. Every home knows it in some way, shape, or form. And so by putting your story out into the world, you've created a safe space of emancipation for those who've read it to be able to identify slowly in their own lives what they've been through and to have that catharsis on their end. And so I thank you for having the courage to share that story because it was not one that was easy for you, and I can see that for certain. And I'm sure you've had many people come up to you in the time that has passed since and tell you about how reading your memoir had an impact on them.
I wish that were not true, and I wish that were not the
Mm.
case, because it is true and it is the case, and that speaks to the brutal and horrific reality that it is to be a woman in South Africa, where GBV, as far as I'm concerned, is a national sport. Like you said, hard pressed to find, we all know somebody. If we haven't experienced it ourselves, we all know of somebody, um, you know, whether it's a friend or whether it's a family member, or we've witnessed it, or we've shared in somebody else's experience. Um, and that's the sad reality, and the thing is, I came out of a background where my career put me in the public eye, right? It was a job, but it was a job that put me in the public eye. And people have this sort of concept or sort of idea of who you are and what you are, just looking at you, like, oh, life is so together and whatever. And we never really know what makes up a person, their past, their present, the experiences that shape a human being. And why I thought it was important as well was, like you say, too few people speak out about it. And we have an idea or a stereotype in our minds of what an abused woman looks like, who
Mm-hmm.
she is, where she comes from. And we also have a very clear sort of image in our mind about who abusive men are, what they look
Yeah.
like, what jobs they do, or maybe they don't have jobs. Maybe they're just hanging around at home, unemployed, drinking and doing drugs. But I think the thing with Beaten Not Broken was that it absolutely decimated this stereotypes that we have of abused women, what they look like, and abusive men, what they look like. Because this is one thing that does not discriminate, not across race, and
Yes.
certainly not across religion.
I feel like that is something that's really important because one of the things I've learned recently is we need to move away from the idea that abusers are monsters because then we have this idea that, oh no, it's not the people we know. Uh-uh. It's husbands and fathers and brothers and sons and mothers and sisters and friends.
Mm.
And when we move away from this idea that, oh, this is just a monster, this is not someone that is a stranger to you, that attacks you in a dark alleyway. No, no, no. It is real people that you work with, that you interact with every single day. And I think what for me feels like the crowning glory of this is that this person did not get to live a life that was protected from their actions. And that I feel is the justice that so many people deserve. Because as you said, justice does not necessarily come in a court of law. And in South Africa, when only 2% of all cases even go to the court of law, this is something that's necessary. And to any victim that's watching, I want to remind them that you are not ruining his life. He did that when he harmed you. They did that when they chose to take these actions against you. You're simply telling your truth.
So often, it's it's such a poignant thing that you say, because so often, and that was one of the things that was thrown at me post the book. He's got a family now, he's got children. You're going to ruin their career, you're disrupting their family life. Well, that responsibility is not mine. you
Yes.
know I, or not any victims for that matter. And I think it is gaslighting in its in its unadulterated form of gaslighting,
Yeah.
is to make the is to make the victim now complicit in rescuing and
Mm,
saving the image, or saving this person, because how can you talk about it? Don't talk about it now. Everybody's moved on. Sure, we've moved on, but the trauma is what the victim has to live with
exactly.
until you take your last breath,
And the
right?
fact remains that
So,
yes, he had a family, so do you. He has kids,
yeah,
so do you. It's gonna affect his life. Well, newsflash, it's affecting yours.
yes. So, we cannot be held hostage, and we cannot be held ransom by this. First, the gaslighting, and it's a very patriarchal mentality, because still as the women, or still as the victim, because they are men who are victims of
Hmm.
abuse as well. Still as the victim, you are now under an obligation to safeguard your abuser. And it's the most insane thing ever, you know. And I don't think, as a victim, whether you're male or female, if you have endured any form of abuse, that it is your obligation to protect your abuser. If you need to talk about it, you talk about it. If it takes you 20 years before you find the strength or the courage to talk about it, so be it. There is no time frame, and nobody gets to dictate or define when you tell your story. You tell it when you're ready, if you're ever ready, if you choose to. If you don't choose to, your prerogative completely. The narratives need to change. And I think, especially in our community, we're starting to see that more, right?
Yes.
Um, 10 years ago, this conversation wouldn't even be happening. You
Mm-mm.
know, 2018, yeah, I think it was 2018 when my book came out. That book would never have happened, you know. Um, and I mean, if you take it back to 10 years, that would have been inconceivable. Like, to even to talk about it was one thing, to put it down on paper was a completely different thing. It's changing. Albeit slowly, but it's changing. And I think the more often that we have conversations like this, and the more often that we are unapologetic,
Yeah.
and we are unashamed of having these conversations, and of saying, well, this is my story. And if it makes you uncomfortable, well, here's the question.
Why?
Are you uncomfortable by the fact that I'm speaking out, or are you uncomfortable by what happened?
Mm,
Because therein says a lot about who
who
you are,
you are.
actually, you know.
Yes.
Um, so the conversations are changing, and I know that my children will read this book one day. My son and my daughters will read it. So I was I did not withhold any information.
Hmm.
Um, I was knowing full well that they will read it one day, and I am quite comfortable
Yes.
for them to read it. Um, I know it will be a devastating thing for them to read.
Yeah.
I have already spoken about it with them, not in detail, but they are aware that this is something that had happened,
Hmm.
because that's conversations I have with my 13-year-old son that I've been having with him for some time
Yes.
about no, the word
No.
no, about respecting not just his own body, but that of any other human being whose space and whose hemisphere he orbits or enters into or is
Mm.
given permission to be in, about how you treat not just women, but human beings as well, but more specifically women, because I speak to my own experience. So it's a conversation I've been having with him for a good few years now. And people may say, well, he's a bit too young. No,
No.
I think they are children. They are children. They are babies in diapers who are being abused. You know, So if there, if a baby in a diaper or a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old can experience abuse, then I think our children are old enough, you know, to have some sort of conversation. And obviously, the
Yes.
degree of the conversation will depend on how old the child is. But there are conversations that need to happen in our homes, um, and we must never shy away from that because it is, it is the unfortunate reality of life, and not just in our community and not just in our country, but life on this planet, abuse, and all those sort of things, rape. Those are all things that are part of reality. Um, and we owe it to our children, you know, to have um, measured conversations depending on age, um, and following it through as they get older. Because I don't think this is a once-off thing. Like, oh,
Mhm.
this is how you treat women, this is how you treat people, this is how you react or respond, and then that's it and done. I think it's a continuous thing. And I, if there's anything I would love for anybody to, to impart with anybody is to have those conversations, because they were not really conversations that we may have grown up with. You
Yes.
know, they were just like pie in the sky sort of ideas and thoughts that were filtered down with, sort of all these euphemisms that people found for, sex out of marriage or this or that or whatever. The conversations were always like, there were always words, phrases, but never quite, so always seemed like really fudge sort of ideas, you know. It's reality, it's life, it's brutal, it's messy. Um, but I think, if we are to do right by the people that come after us, the children that come after us, um, then I think we are obliged by virtue of that to have open, honest conversations, whether we experience something or not.
I feel like that is something I stand with you, 10 toes on, because the conversations that need to happen, they need to happen because our kids are experiencing this. As you're saying, young children are victims of abuse. And unfortunately, sometimes the perpetrator is also a child. And that child has learned that behavior somewhere. And if we as the adults do not mold and nurture them in the correct way, those actions will then go on to escalate. And I think another reason why these conversations and books like yours are important is because sometimes we don't know what abuse looks like. We don't know. How many women didn't know that they have an option to say no to their husband, that their husband does not have the right to have them just lay there and take it, that there was a choice, that you're not his property. People don't know that. And until we have these in-depth, gory conversations, people are not going to know. And it's going to continue. And this is the power in writing, in books, is that suddenly people are able to learn what previously, as you say, was now in euphemisms and sort of this airy-fairy language which didn't actually give much guidance. People just tried to figure out what it meant, and it seemed so remote. Meanwhile, this is a part of day-to-day life. And as you're saying, it's not just a conversation to take place one time. It's something that kids need to learn and see in their lives over and over again, that these are the patterns and behaviors that you should do, and these are the things that you should not do. And what do you think has been the lesson that you learned the most from your first memoir?
That you know the story doesn't necessarily end when you put down the last word and handed it in for for publication. There's a lot of the after effects and the aftermath of it. Um, and for me, the important sort of thing that I've taken out from writing is that you you have to be prepared. And I don't think we actually fully understand it or appreciate it, but because you're so wrapped up in writing that what comes after it, because you will face scrutiny, you will face hate, you will face criticism, uh, you will be crucified with your story and your words. And that is something that any writer should be prepared for, is that what you put down in writing and what you put down, whether fact or fiction, whether it's memoir or a crime story or a children's book or whatever, if you've not put in, oh, that's a terrible word to use, not even a word. If you have put something down, on writing, in a book, if you've put something down on pages in a book, you have to be prepared. And when I say the word die, I'm obviously using it poetically, but to die for these words and to
Mm.
die by these words, because that is what it is, and I don't think I had anticipated that, um, before writing, whether it was my first memoir or my second memoir. You think you just write and everyone's going to read it, and yeah, some people may not like it, but we live in an age of social media where people will come at you and whatever their agendas are. People seem to take your experience as the writer very personally, which I find quite strange, in terms of personally, like, in terms of like the criticism or the hate, or like, how dare you write about that? How dare you have even said something like that? Well, I mean, it is my writing. You're quite entitled to write something of your own, but that is the one thing that I've learned from the children's book right up until the recent the Village Indian, that people take what you write very personally. People
Yeah.
can get quite offended. I mean, the most random of people that the story is not even about or nothing to do with will take offense. And you will always have that as a writer. In fact, I will go a step further and say, if you haven't offended anybody, then if you haven't stirred, you know, then have you actually done right by yourself,
Okay.
by your story, and by what you've written? Because any piece of literature, fact or fiction, should always seek to stir, whether it is the moral conscience, whether it is human empathy, whether it is rage, whether it is sadness, whether it is grief. You must seek to stir, because in stirring that inner reader, you are compelling them to see things through a different perspective, whether they like it or not, because sometimes people don't like it, and that's okay. It is important for people, to criticize and critique writing, but to critique an experience, then
Yeah.
that also teaches you, um, okay, so there are clearly issues around these issues that people feel uncomfortable with. And obviously, it's something that needs to be delved into even deeper the next time around, whether it's issues of abuse, of identity, of belonging, of race relations, whatever it is. If it's making people uncomfortable, that is great. It's great if it's making people uncomfortable.
So this actually it ties in a bit with what I learned when I was just getting into radio, which was your intention is to make people feel something, regardless of what it is that they're feeling. And I feel like that ties in so well with what you said is we must stir the pot because if you're only meeting with thoughts that align with your own, what are you learning? You're not being exposed to the world at large. So if you're encountering something and it's stirring something within you, then it means that there's room for growth, there's room for your perspective